Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 11, The Gotcha Verses, Part 1, with our in-studio guest, Reverend Philip Tanner. Hey, Philip, welcome back to This Week in Heresy.
Hey, Gina, it's good to be back.
So what are we talking about today?
Well, what we are going to talk about today is an area that we already covered in the original video, This Week in Heresy. We're going to go back into the New Testament and look at the several specific places that anti-gay Christians use that are often called the clobber verses or the gotcha verses.
Right.
And so there will, in a sense, this is review for those that saw the original videos.
Right.
But I want to present it a little bit differently with the greater scholarship that I have and to focus on cultural aspect, which is something that in my first episode of the podcast, I talked about in terms of cultural values in translation.
Right. Cool. Well, why don't we go ahead and start? So the first one is what?
Well, the first one, I'm going to actually, for those listeners who know the order of the books of the New Testament, I'm going to actually go in reverse order from the back forward. And there are reasons of convenience as well as reasons of scope.
Right.
Because as we go through these, they will get progressively bigger and bigger in a sense. So the first one is the last one, just like Jesus. The last is first. It is a tiny little book called the Book of Jude.
Right, right.
And it is a strange little epistle, and it has only one chapter and only 25 verses. It in the canon, it appears as the penultimate book. So literally, when you finish this tiny little epistle to Jude, the next thing you read is the end time. It is the book of Revelation. What's particularly interesting about this strange little epistle is that the Greek text is quite passionate and quite florid.
Right.
And the thing about it is, in its very short text, it provides this sort of vast overview in an epic sweep of the Israelite history, and then immediately leads into the final prophecy of John's apocalypse, also known as Revelation.
Yeah.
The reason that this is an important place to mention is that it contains a very specific reference to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, right.
And, you know, it is written in a sense with an insider's perspective. And it basically says, you know the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of these things that happened there. Right. And so this is one of the many times when understanding the New Testament really requires you to know some Old Testament, let's say.
Right.
And this specific reference to Sodom and Gomorrah for readers that are not versed in the Hebrew Bible is just exactly what were those sins.
Right.
And in the Epistle to Jude, it's specifically verse 7. It's first chapter because there's only one chapter.
Right.
And as it describes those sins, it focuses on two specific things: fornication and the pursuit of strange flesh.
Right.
Now, I happen to find a delicious linguistic irony because in the Koine text, the way that you discuss this strange flesh harkens back to the Old Testament call for solidarity and purity in the ancient tribes of Israel. In other words, the strange flesh is that flesh which is different.
Right.
Canaanite flesh. Funnily enough, the way that you say that in ancient Greek is heteros, as in heterosexual. So there's an interesting little turn there.
Right.
That strange flesh is that flesh which is different.
So is it more in the strange flesh as flesh that is not yours?
Exactly. Flesh that is not yours, and by extension, flesh that is not of your tribe. And what is particularly funny as a biblical scholar about this is that the Hebrew Bible's real discussion of what it is that those people in Sodom and Gomorrah did that was so bad that God just smote them off the earth,
right,
is poor hospitality.
Right.
And some would add wanting to have sex with angels. And that gets into a whole discussion about Old Testament. And
I remember that one.
yeah, when we get into discussing the Septuagint in a later appearance of me on this podcast, or I suppose appearance is the wrong verb there or noun there. But yes, there was, quote, irregular sexual impulses, but it was the fact that those impulses occurred within poor hospitality that really pissed God off. Mm-hmm. And so as a biblical scholar, I find it interesting that the focus of Jude's epistle on this is not even so much the lack of hospitality, but the strangeness of the sexual behavior. Mm-hmm. And even if we accept that the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah included homosexuality, we are still left with this basic truth that the author of this tiny epistle appears to be focusing only on fornication and the pursuit of different non-Israelite folk as sex objects. Mm-hmm. The unavoidable conclusion is it's not really about homosexuality. So that's one clobber verse gone.
Boom. Done.
And that's all we need to say about Jude.
Well, I suppose like some people, even with your level of education and everything and your level of understanding of the Greek, some people might conclude that, strange flesh would be not of your tribe, aka not Christian.
And in fact, you could extend it that way. Honestly, with my linguistic understanding, and my understanding of Hebrew is much more limited, but I do have some experience with it. It is my secondary biblical language. Mm-hmm. It is more easy if you accept that you cannot translate without values, which goes back to my first episode.
Right.
And you're willing to admit what your values are consciously. Mm-hmm. It is actually, unfortunately, perhaps for those of us that are radical inclusionists, it is much easier to extend the translation to apply to non-Christians than it is to apply to people with the same genitalia. The Greek lends itself to that more easily. Huh. And in the cultural context of when this epistle was likely written, it would actually make sense that that is why the author focuses on that aspect of Sodom and Gomorrah's sins. Because there was a great controversy going on at this time in the birth of the early church, or the early birth of the church, about just exactly who is the new tribe. Because the Apostle Paul repeatedly discusses this idea that the Jews are still the Jews, and there's some wonderful pastoral metaphors and agrarian metaphors, such as in the Epistle of the Romans, that the Jews are the ancient vine, specifically olive trees, and that essentially what the God of the Jews is doing is a metaphor of how olive farming works, where your hardy wild olives are the Greeks. And, the manicured, perfect, law-abiding olives that are in the farm are the Jews. But the more that those olives grow without an infusion of wildness, let's say, the more staid they become. And so there's this great grafting metaphor that the Apostle Paul that's really one of his big deals, is that the new covenant in Jesus is available to the Greeks, which is this whole thing where you don't have to become Jewish before you become Christian. So within that context, we're seeing a different emphasis that you could argue that this is referring to people not of the tribe, but in order to do that, you have to go back to the definition of the tribe. And if you are what scholars and the Apostle Paul would have called a Judaizer, you would believe that essentially you can't be of the tribe if you aren't of the tribe literally, an Israelite, or you become part of the tribe by becoming a follower of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. Therefore, pagans, y'all lose. I don't like that. And as a translator, I would struggle with it. Personally, this is one of those places where I would be hard pressed to come up with a translation that is unquote, properly inclusive of all religious traditions. But yet at the same time, if I push for that, I'm taking away the voice of the author of this epistle, who was clearly referring to something.
Yeah. And you know, and it's not something you really, I don't think you really need to dilute it that way. Right. You know, you say, basically you translate it and say, here's the context of which this was translated. And we talked about that before. But, you know, people really, in general, it seems like a lot of people are like, oh, well, you know, it must mean this even now. And it's like, no, like, remember context. This was written many, many years ago, centuries ago. Yeah. And
extending the argument even, you know, further, even if you do choose to conclude that it was referring to, you know, Dianic, Temple of Artemis Diana, Temple of Apollo, Temple of whoever cult, you're still faced with the fact that the writer of that epistle was not writing about the same group that are called pagans today.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, no matter how you slice it, even like all religions, I mean, and I've been talking about this with several different people, you know, all religions have moved greatly from where they started.
Often literally, physically, but often theologically or spiritually as well.
So, you know, the Roman Catholic Church is nothing like the first Christian churches.
And that poses issues of understanding even for those of us that, well, let me put it this way. Linguists, when in doubt, we go back to the words. You know, we can be intellectually dishonest and perhaps even ethically inappropriate by running away from these controversial and challenging issues of cultural appropriation and appropriateness in translation by just, you know, making it scientific and saying, well, this word means this and therefore. Yeah. But even geography is an issue. You're not going to have these pastoral metaphors and these agrarian metaphors in a culture that doesn't practice that kind of agriculture. You know, Inuits wouldn't write about olives.
Right.
So it's a foreign text in another level for a group that is not of that geography.
Right. Well, even bishops talked about that, you know, how there's a lot of the, you know, using a scythe or, you know, threshing the wheat. And, you know, a lot of people are like, what's that? I don't know what that is. Yeah. I mean, they can always Google it, but still, you know, off the top of your head, unless you're kind of geeky like I am when I know these things, or, you know, you just happen to be curious about it, you know, you won't know.
Yeah. And actually, I'll even use that favorite seminary word. I will problematize that further. Yes, you can always Google it if you have access to the internet.
That's right.
What if you don't?
That's right.
And, you know, I was watching, I've been going back through the 254 episodes of Buffy and Angel. And realizing just how much technology has changed, even how stories are told in the last 15 or so years. Payphones are a major issue. And finding a phone is a major issue as recently as Joss Whedon's, you know, development of the Buffyverse, because people didn't really have cell phones. And in fact, it becomes a point of humor, albeit dark humor in Angel. And, you know, what does this have to do with biblical translation? Well, posit, if you will, a culture that is scientifically advanced in its own terms, and then jump forward 1,000 years or 2,000 years. If we wrote a religious text in terms of, you know, quantum physics, let's say, because that's new and exotic to us, 1,000 years from now, it's entirely possible that anthropologists would look at that writing and go, oh, how cute of those little technological children.
Right.
And not understand how profoundly religious we were when we wrote that text.
Right.
Which makes me realize that I should have another episode where I talk about quantum Christianity. But that, again, out of scope.
Yeah.
All this from a tiny 25-verse epistle.
Hey. Well, why don't we, you know, in the interest of time and stuff, why don't we move on to the next one?
Okay. So the next place that we're going to camp out on is the first Timothy 1, 1 Timothy, the first epistle to Timothy, or of Timothy, depending on what you believe about who wrote it.
Right.
Specifically, chapter 1, verse 10. And again, being a believer in don't take my word for it, I am going to give some bibliographic reference here, which I'm sure will show up in the notes for this episode. Right. One of the fundamental books for an analysis of stuff is the Strong's Concordance of the Bible. And I happen to see one sitting in the studio right now.
Yeah,
and in
right
fact,
on the printer, trying to keep the cats off the printer.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah, how's that working out for you?
Actually, it works pretty well. It is big.
I think we covered some of what the Strong's Concordance is in my first episode, but we really did not discuss it, right?
You basically explained it, but we didn't go into too much depth.
Okay. Well, just as a quick review, this crazy Scotsman, Professor Strong, indexed every word of the entire text of the King James Bible. That's a lot of words. And, this was 160 years ago.
Yeah.
He didn't have, Command F to do a find. He didn't have electrical. He didn't have light. So
it's like 1, 2, 3. Right?
Exactly. No database, and so this was a monumental undertaking. And what he did, based on the King James English, is indexed the words into essentially like folklorists will think of tale types. The different cultures' versions of what we would call the Cinderella story have the same tale type number.
Right.
And of course, he has Hebrew and Greek. He put the Aramaic under the Hebrew. There's your Trivial Pursuit, name the third language of the Bible. It's Aramaic, and yes, there is Aramaic there. And so it is very common in this analysis, when you're focusing down in on one word that becomes critical to meaning, to speak of the Strong's entry.
Right.
In other words, in this massive tome of the index of every word of the King James English, where is it? What entry number is it?
Right.
There's the H entries and the G entries for Hebrew and Greek. And obviously we're looking at Greek. So the specific word that we're going to look at is arsenokoites. And it, again, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. And the Strong's entry for that is G733. So if your listeners just really want to check me out, which, again, this is my Pastor Melissa Scott inspiration, do not take my word for any of this, because you may look something up and go, okay, I see how Philip gets there, but I disagree.
Right.
Or I agree that we're going to get there, but I think it is important to emphasize another shade of meaning, for example. So G733, you go to your Strong's Concordance, you find the Greek stuff, and you look until you find entry 733. Again, the word is asinokoites.
Right.
And immediately we are going to jump into a particular challenge that translators face. Even if we get into this whole all translation have values and I have a bias and I'm going to claim my bias, and so, don't hate, all that. What do we do when a word only appears once or twice in the entire King James Bible?
Right.
Or even more importantly, for linguistics, what do we do when it appears only once or twice in one testament in one language?
Right.
Now, a listener may want to know why the King James. And that's a matter of history. The King James was the definitive worldwide English translation of the Christian Holy Bible for centuries.
Right.
And it would have been the Strong's Concordance would not have had the success that it has had if it were not the King James.
Right.
And again, just as a little aside, like what I do, for example, is if I'm looking to do a word study on one word or the impact of one word on a whole message, I will use the King James English as the starting point because of the Strong's the concordance being indexed to it. However, I never stop with one English translation. I always go to multiple English translations.
Right.
And so back to the specific word, asinokoites. This word only occurs 2 times in the New Testament. Ironically, the other place where it occurs is in 1 Corinthians, which we will actually be discussing very shortly.
Right.
or somewhat shortly.
Yeah.
Now, what does this word mean? Well, here's an interesting thing about language. Languages that build words through inflection, suffixes, prefixes, conjugations, declensions, students of Latin listening to this will know.
Yeah, I know that one.
Oh, yes. You can often construct a meaning through that kind of paradigm is actually the word that linguists use.
Right.
With one word, very precisely, that cannot be translated into a language. Sorry, my linguist nerd wanted to come in and say, that is differently agglutinative or has a different SVO order. But you often cannot do that kind of translation from one word to one word.
Right.
And this is an example of that. Translators, particularly into the Germanic languages and English, can only begin to capture a realistic sense of what we think this word means, which we don't really know, by translating it as a whole bunch of other words.
Right.
And I mean, a pile of words.
Yeah, yeah.
And this becomes particularly problematic when a translator thinks that it's suggesting something and can't efficiently say it in their target language, so they come up with a phrase containing a lot of words that they think captures the essence of the word.
Right.
Confused? Well,
I mean, I've seen that in a lot of other languages, especially because, I've studied a little bit of Japanese and I've seen different things in Chinese where, they'll have one word that doesn't quite translate like the same way twice.
Right. Exactly.
So,
and this is another, I'm just going to keep, bringing this point home.
Right.
Culture becomes a major factor here.
Right.
One of my favorite examples, which you don't need to be a student of dead languages to understand, is simpático in Spanish.
Right.
Because the word simpático in Spanish means, nice or, sympathetic.
Right.
But even people who don't speak Spanish listening to this podcast might be aware of the fact that there is a construction, which you'll actually hear Spanish speakers who speak English fluently say, we have a real simpático between us, or you and I have a simpático. Well, what the hell does that mean? The easiest way to translate that into English is you and I have a state of existence between us that is more than just simply a physical relationship, but might or might not be sexual, that probably contains elements of religion and spirituality, but may or may not. We may have shared terms, we may not.
Right.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Another example that Spanish has, which actually comes from Latin, is abundancia. It means abundance, but it's a philosophical term.
Right.
And we do this in our own language. I mean,
absolutely.
A person who is not a student of linguistics would have a lot harder time understanding the way I would speak about this if I were not deliberately trying to use regular English American words.
Yeah.
So that said, what does this mean? Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, folks. I'm pretty sure that this was referring to some form of homosexual behavior. And it is simply unavoidable. The only way that you could sanitize it, and I don't mean that homosexuality is dirty and needs to be sanitized.
Right.
I mean sanitize it so that it's not talking about homosexuality, would be to do what I call doing violence to the text. You're simply ripping the text into a place that it was not intended to go.
Right.
This word, asinokoites, is problematic because, again, it appears only 2 times. And this one's even more problematic because this way that this word is being used does not occur in any other writing in the Hellenistic Greek language. So even if you go to the pagan writings of the time, and I'm putting that in quotes because we don't even know what a writing is here because we don't have original documents, again, to remind that. You can't even use that. So as, again, a responsible ethical translator, I would want to resort to looking at historical data.
Right.
What do we know? If we accept that this sentence is potentially hangs on one specific word, whether it's about homosexuality or not, then we must necessarily recognize that, one, it occurs within a list of vices. The Apostle Paul is very fond of giving a list of vices.
Yeah, he tends to do that, yes.
Yeah. People who want this list of vices to have this word asinakoites mean gay people or people who do gay things have to recognize that there is a historical context. You can't say that the author just made it up.
Right.
So we need to look at what was going on that would be considered homosexuality at the time. And we do have ample historical evidence that man-on-man sex, and I'm going to be a little R-rated here.
Yeah.
Specifically, anal sex between men, and specifically anal sex between men done as a way of feminizing the receptive partner.
Right.
We have ample evidence that this occurred, and that there are two specific concepts of time in which this occurred. Concept number one would be orgy practices of the temples, such as Artemis Diana.
Right, right.
And the other one would be actually a practice that you can argue goes back to the ancient Israelites, but we're not going to get into that, is how soldiers that conquer a people rape everybody.
Right.
We're talking children, boys and girls, we're talking women, and we're talking men. And specifically the way that they rape the men is throwing them down on their face and raping them anally.
Right.
I think we can all agree that rape in the context of war and conquest is just not under any circumstances okay.
Absolutely.
So I'm not even going to go there. I'm perfectly fine translating this to say that it's against that. I'm okay with that.
If you want examples of that, just go watch Game of Thrones and you're all set.
Exactly. And, you know, the fact that it occurs within a list of vices that aren't about that, you know, that aren't about war, would actually make a choice to do that translation suspect. Or not, depending on whether you care about that or not. I do. So we're faced with looking at this cultic pagan sense to which the text is referring. Again, orgiastic practices in these pagan temples where everybody was doing everything in every way possible with every orifice, and that's just the way it was. So, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, could it also kind of refer to the where we get patriarchy from, the patron system, where, you know, you have the head of household and all that?
It could. The challenge of going down that line of reasoning is that the writers of the epistolary part of the New Testament, and I do say it that way because I do not believe that all of the epistles were written by the Apostle Paul. Right. Apostle Paul, not the Epistle Paul. But even those that purport to be written by him would have shared enough of a cultural context that, first of all, they wouldn't really have thought of the patronage system as a system because it was just the way things were.
Right,
you know, critical self-reflection and moral meta-analysis is not particularly a feature of the ancient world. That's a very Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment.
True.
That said, though, you could make that argument. You could. And, you know, since we're going there, I think it is important for us to recognize that it is my personal opinion that a substantial majority of the people who use the word patriarchy today in our postmodern, I don't want to say radical feminist because that just will set up a series of minefields that I do not wish to navigate in a translation-related podcast episode, don't actually know what they're saying. What they're saying is, you know, andrarchy. In other words, men are in charge. Yeah. Well, yes, in the patriarchal system, men were in charge. But what's important was the power differential. And it's not, all men were not in charge. Men were in charge of other men under the system of patriarchy. Now, was it inherently more unfair to women? Of course it was.
Absolutely.
I'm not one of these, poo-poo, men don't have their rights. Oh, please. I'm sorry to sound a little radical here.
That's all right. It is This Week in Heresy.
No, I'm not. I'm not sorry. But even if we go there, we run into some cultural vagueness.
Right.
Again, we assume that this is written in the terms of men's behavior.
Yeah.
So we could make that argument.
Yeah.
What we still are faced with is that it's a different kind of vice than the vices that's surrounded in the list.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, it's different than some of them. Fornication is a sexual behavior, but it would be considered men and women.
Right.
And one of the frequent things in the epistolary list of vices are drunkenness and gluttony about food.
Yeah.
And okay, gluttony about sex. Okay, we could go there, but yet we are still faced with the fact that there are, gluttony about drink and gluttony about food are listed separately. So if we're saying gluttony about sex, then we're saying gluttony about sex with men and gluttony about sex with women, which logically opens up the question, what if you're having sex with men and you're not doing it gluttonously?
Right.
Maybe they were, maybe they weren't.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We'll never know.
And
for sure.
It occurs to me that I said that there are two contexts, and it's important for us to look at the patriarchal system here as it existed there, that there was a third context. And I will discuss this later in either the Corinthians or the Romans of our remaining two. In the patronage system, it was somewhat sexually sanctioned in the Hellenistic history for patriarchs, men with power and privilege, to take a young male under their wing and train them in the ways of life, which included teaching them how to write, teaching them how to read, teaching them science, and teaching them sex. And that involves things that we would probably call pedophilia, molestation. Again, I'm okay with speaking out against that. I'm not a member of NAMBLA, and I don't wish to be a member of NAMBLA.
Well, absolutely. But
and so
it's a different time, a different context.
Right.
Because, they didn't use the word homosexual in the way we mean it,
Exactly.
And, up until not too very recently, the word homosexual wasn't even used, period. There was, invert and other terms that were used instead.
Exactly.
So it was just like, you can't really subscribe certain things to a different time period because you just don't know and you don't have any proof that is true.
Exactly.
Like the Sapphic verses,
Yep.
Same thing, is she referring to women in a loving context, in that kind of romantic loving context? Well, yes, of course she is.
Yeah.
However, does it necessarily mean it was a specifically lesbian thing?
Probably not.
May or may not.
Yeah.
She could have been bisexual.
Right. Yeah. And,
we don't know.
Functionally speaking, I mean,
probably was.
If we define bisexuality as being attracted to both genders on a hypothetical gender binary that may or may not exist, that was a teaser for other episodes. Wasn't it?
Oh yes.
These older men in the patronage system were functionally bisexual. Every single one of them that was doing this was, because they had women for children and property control, and they had boys for, doing their societal duty to teach the next generation.
Yeah.
Hello, folks. They probably enjoyed it too.
Some of them, yeah. Most of them.
Let's be honest. And, and I also want to point about this word, asinakoites, that often, particularly with these words that don't occur very often, often with these words that don't occur very often, one way that we analyze them is to break them into constituent parts, because Greek is an agglutinative language. And it often builds meaning by smacking two words together that may or may not naturally have gone together. You can break this word apart two constituent words, and I'll say what they are. Adin, which is entry G730, which, if you realize that arsenokoitis is G733, strong did tend to group families of words together based on their roots. But the second half of the word is koiti, which is G2845. Now, the word Adin, G730, pretty much nobody disagrees. This means male. It has something to do with maleness. And G2845 by itself, koiti, may sound familiar. Think of the Latin word coitus.
Right.
So you could argue by separating the word that it means something like male sex. Okay. That would be an excellent way to interpret this as an obvious verse against gay men. Okay, one, it's not about gay women. So there, okay, so gay women go to heaven, but I'm going to hell. Don't really think Jesus said that, but okay.
No. Well, he didn't mention anything about stuff. Yeah. So that's another
except
thing.
One particular time when he said that men are supposed to marry women because that's how Adam and Eve were created. But even that is debatable. Because he said that as a beginning of throwing the entire Levitical code on its ass. But anyway, no offense to Jews. I do apologize.
Moving on.
But again, even if we defined, even if we decided to translate that word as an absolute injunction against homosexual behavior, we are still, and this refers back to my first episode of your podcast, left with facing the fact that what modern societies consider to be gayness is a modern development. At the time of the writing of this epistle, 1 Timothy could not have been a reference to gayness as the term of identity we know, because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And you know, again, some of the more radical listeners might bristle at what I just said. There were no gay people back then.
Right.
Doesn't mean that there wasn't homosexuality. Doesn't mean that there hasn't always been people knocking boots with people that are like them in genitalia. It just means that the social structure that we call being gay did not exist back then.
Right.
Because the social structures that did exist are what we've already talked about. You know, anal rape and war, what we would call pedophilia in the patronage system, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So again, it remains problematic.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what's the next one?
Okay, so the next one takes us to, that lovely first epistle of the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth.
Oh my, yes.
Now, your fans of the video This Week in Heresy that remember me as the Greek Geek there will remember my, lovely point about how, there are other extra-biblical Hellenistic sources that actually insult women to call them a whore by calling them Corinthian girls.
Oh, yep.
There are also, let's just say, Corinth was known as a crossroads of the known world.
Oh, so it was the Vegas of its time.
It was the Vegas, the San Francisco, and the Washington, D.C. with a healthy dose of Moscow and London.
Oh, there we go.
And, maybe even, and let's not forget Amsterdam. Okay. Lots of Amsterdam going on there. So as a historian, this is fascinating. The context in which this is written is particularly fascinating because this is an epistle that is written to, the fledgling, I'll use the word Christian here, but understand there were no Christians. These were Messianic Jews who believed that Jesus was the Jewish Mashiach.
Right.
Sorry, I went to a radical seminary.
Yeah, that's another episode in and of itself.
Episode or 5.
Right.
So, not so surprisingly, we're going to find another list of vices.
Yay.
And it is a point where the Apostle Paul is essentially saying to the followers in Corinth, essentially, make no mistake, these following things, which we are calling vices, are not in the way of following Jesus. Therefore, people who do them, God's going to deal with them on God's own time.
Right.
I will also point out that means that you don't have to. So even if you are anti-gay, stay the hell out of the gay person's personal life. You can turn that logic that way.
That would be nice.
And you will actually hear Christians who morally oppose homosexuality who do not necessarily support, for example, an intrusion on the Establishment Clause, such as in the state of North Carolina, that is in the process of, I pray to God, being tossed out by the otherwise reactionary 5 men on the Supreme Court. Oh, another political statement. That's for my future podcast, where essentially right now in the state of North Carolina, it is illegal for ordained clergy to perform a wedding that is not supported by a legal marriage license, because that's what that law says. Well, that law defines marriage as between one woman and one man.
Right.
Therefore, that couple cannot get a marriage license, which therefore means that if a church wishes to conduct a rite of marriage in the religious tradition, they are now legally prohibited from doing so. Folks, that's in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
Quite.
And constitutionally, it is such a clear violation that the people who are writing briefs in support of the human rights lawsuits include the Southern Baptists.
Wow.
And in their
impressive.
in their amicus brief, they actually say, while we unapologetically maintain a complete and total opposition to same-sex marriage, we cannot in good conscience allow the Establishment Clause to be violated this way, because who's going to stop the next one?
Right.
Now, as a person who grew up in the Bible Belt, I will say that there's probably some Islamophobia here, because everybody in the Bible Belt is just so afraid that Sharia law will become the law of the land.
Which
I'm like,
it's just like, what? No. Waste of time.
Yeah, boy, did we stray from the topic. But anyway, so let's go specifically
it's
to
that time of year.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, for folks that don't know, the time we're recording this, we're having weird, humid weather from the desert monsoons in Arizona. So everybody's just in a weird space.
Yeah.
Anyway. So let's go specifically to the 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9. And the specific word is malakos. And for those that are wondering, I am doing what is hypothesized to be a somewhat more correct pronunciation of the Greek of the time. Not malakos, but malakos.
Yeah.
That is Strong's entry G3120. And well, this one is a little bit easier because it doesn't occur only once or twice. It occurs all of 4 times.
Hey,
in the Greek in the New
improving.
Testament. Yeah. And just as a matter of trivia, what I do think is interesting is that the other 3 times where it occurs are all in the Synoptic Gospels. Yes. The place where this word malakos occurs in the Gospel of Luke is at chapter 7, verse 25. And the 2 places where malakos occurs in the other place it occurs is the Gospel of Matthew, and both occurrences are in Matthew chapter 11, verse 8.
Right.
Now, this is intriguing, but maybe not for the reason one might think. You know, it's always intriguing when it occurs in the Gospels because, you know, story of Jesus and all that.
Absolutely.
The 3 places where malakos occurs in the Synoptic Gospels are pretty much clearly references to softness in the sense of fabrics. Like, you know, soft clothing, soft raiment. I believe, my biblical literacy is going to take a hit here. I think it's in Matthew where it occurs, but it may actually, well, it's the transfiguration of Jesus, I do believe. You know, in other words, when he is transfigured, what he is transfigured into is as of wearing very soft and luxurious clothing. Okay, so what we are left here is the fact that we have a word that occurs 4 times in the Greek. 3 times are clearly making the same meaning and are clearly different than the 4th.
Yeah.
So in a certain sense, even though the word malakos, we say it occurs 4 times, we can pretty much conclude that it only occurs with whatever it means 1 time. And it's here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9. And just in case I forgot, the Strong's entry is G3120.
Right.
And it's in a list of vices. What do you know? Again, 1 Corinthians 6 contains a list of vices.
Of course it does.
And just to make it even more fun, in this text, the word malakos occurs as an item in the list just after the words for adulterers, and just before another item in the list, arsenokoites. So again, yes, there are two terms here that may be about homosexuality, and the first one we just talked about at length in 1 Timothy.
Right.
So we're not going to talk about it again. We're going to talk about Malakos. Well, again, we're in a list of vices of Corinth. Since there is a heavy emphasis on sexual behavior in lists of vices in general, we know that it's probably sexual.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Again, when we look at other known sources of language and cultural sources for the Hellenistic era, one could conclude that Malakos is perhaps a specific reference to the specific homosexuality of older men mentoring young boys sexually.
Ah, yeah. Okay. So here's where that comes in.
Right.
You think?
Because if you step back from the controversy about homosexuality and religion, or homosexuality and Christianity, and just look at it logically for a minute,
right,
and pretend that you don't have a bias when you're doing it.
Right.
Because if you think you don't have a bias, you're lying.
Right.
If the word malakos means soft, in that sense of soft clothing.
Yeah.
And if we see that this word is existing next to this word arsinokoites, which we agree is something about man-on-man sex.
Right.
We could construct an argument, as I did in the video appearance where I talked about this word.
Right.
That it's something to do with like soft boys. Or, men who are soft, or males who are soft.
Right.
Could that be a slam against transvestites, cross-dressers, or trans men? Okay, maybe it is.
Maybe.
Again, transgenderism, there we go. As it exists in our society today, I'm that much of an ally, I said we, didn't exist back then. Now, historically, we can argue about its existence in sort of, the civilizations of the ancient Indus Valley and what we call Native Americans and all that, but it didn't exist in this form in the modern sense of the word.
Right.
Okay. So I personally want this to mean, the softness of youth. In other words, boys. In other words, don't screw young boys.
Right.
Again, I'm okay with doing an injunction against that in a Christian religious list of vices. But even here, I want to take a time to make a moral statement. Because there are some conservative Christians, some Christians that I would characterize as conservative. Right. That and I try not to let my derision show when I say this, in a more enlightened, or desire to be more enlightened about human sexuality, will extend this to say that, well, it doesn't mean all gay people, just the really sissy ones. Just, the soft ones, the effeminate ones. And in fact, there are translations of this into English that focus on that. That some of which are widely read. Again, I don't have it just at the top of my tongue right now.
Well, if you think about it later, we can put it in the show notes.
Sure, why not? But I'm going to make a moral, and I feel it is my moral and ethical duty to speak out against this. It has just popped into my head, newsflash. The King James Bible translates malakos as effeminate. There are widely read translations. See, it all comes back, folks. It's body memory.
Right.
That choose to call it male prostitute.
Ah, right. I was thinking about that because I was wondering if that's in there too.
Yeah. First of all, there are Hellenistic historical sources that would disagree with one or both of those translations. I am not an ancient Hellenistic scholar. I'm a linguist. Right. So I do not pretend to have the expertise to make that argument. Right. I just know that it's there. Check it out. Find a classics professor. Yeah. But I want to sit here for a minute and look at the impact of translating this word malakos as effeminate. as well as male prostitute. So let's start with this effeminate thing. The question that I pose to the listener is, does God think that a faithful Christian man has to be a John Wayne macho type? In other words, can you only be gay and a Christian if you're, I'm hearing the Village People song Macho Man in my head.
Right.
I don't like that.
Well, I don't buy it either.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Because it gets into this kind of conditional tribalism.
Right.
First of all, the idea that an effeminate gay man and a somewhat in the middle leaning slightly toward masculine gay man such as myself somehow have a different status in the eye of God. That leaves me with a not so fresh feeling.
Yeah, not so good. And you know, the idea that God, well, I mean, this is another whole podcast in itself too, is, you know, the idea that God is that small and petty.
Right.
That, you know, he has this hierarchy of who's good, who's bad, who's going to hell, who's not.
Exactly.
It boggles the mind.
Exactly. Now, you know, this is probably something I should do on my own podcast in the episode where I say that it's going to be R-rated or borderline NC-17. Logically speaking, you can argue an exemption there and saying, well, it's okay to be gay as long as you're really masculine and have sex with only really masculine guys. So, you know, muscle queens that work out at gay gyms, they go to heaven, but I don't.
Not so much.
Can I cuss now?
Lightly.
What I was going to say was not a light cuss word. Starts with a sh, ends with an it.
Well, you know, we
and comes out of a bull.
Right.
Anyway, it just don't fly, folks.
Right.
It just don't fly.
No. I'd like to thank Philip for joining us this week. Don't forget to tune in next week where we will continue this conversation. And as always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. There you can also subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, join our forums, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.